Imagine a valley where death has ruled for so long that even the dust has settled on the bones. No breath, no motion, just silence. Now picture a voice breaking through that stillness, a voice asking, "Son of man, can these bones live?" This isn't just a story from an ancient scroll. This is a confrontation between hopelessness and hope, between silence and prophecy, and what could be. What do you do when everything looks beyond repair? It's about modern souls, people who walk, talk, and breathe, but inside feel hollow, emotionally numb, spiritually silent, socially disconnected. You might not see bones on the outside, but inside, you're in the valley. And maybe, just maybe, God brought you here not to bury you, but to breathe into you. When your faith feels dry, your dreams buried, and your identity forgotten. This vision from the book of Ezekiel isn't about ancient skeletons. Ezekiel was a priest in exile, living far from his homeland. Babylon had crushed Jerusalem, the temple got, the kingdom shattered, the people broken, scattered, and stripped of purpose. They weren't just displaced geographically, they were dismantled spiritually. For them, the exile felt like a divine silence, like God had walked away. And in the middle of this despair, God gives Ezekiel a vision, a valley full of dry bones. Not fresh, not recent, very dry. This video is more than just a study. It's an invitation. The Valley of Dry Bones is one of those places. It's not just a physical space, it's a state of the soul. Anyone who has ever faced a season of spiritual or emotional ruin knows exactly what this feels like. Families where no one looks each other in the eyes anymore. Churches where worship happens but God's presence is missing. Hearts still beating but already giving up on living. And it's precisely there that God chooses to begin speaking, to see what God sees in the valley, to believe again, to breathe again. Because what Ezekiel saw was not the end. It was the beginning of something that still echoes through time, lifeless, hopeless, and then comes the question, can these bones live? It's not a question about anatomy, it's about faith. About whether we dare to believe that what looks dead ... can be revived, that what looks scattered can stand again. So let me ask you something, have you ever felt like one of those bones? Forgotten, rejected, beyond healing? There are places in life where the silence is so deep it feels like God has gone away. The Valley of Dry Bones is one of those places. It's not just a physical space, it's a state of the soul. Anyone who has ever faced a season of spiritual or emotional ruin knows exactly what this feels like. Families where no one looks each other in the eyes anymore. Churches where worship happens but God's presence is missing. Hearts still beating but already giving up on living. And it's precisely there that God chooses to begin speaking. This valley represents more than destruction. It reveals the portrait of broken lives, like a beautiful house on the outside, but with invisible cracks deep in its foundation. Maybe you know someone like that. Maybe you are that someone. Appearances can be deceiving. A marriage still posting on Instagram but no longer sharing any prayers. Young voices leading worship with beauty, but unable to pray in private. God's question to Ezekiel wasn't about the scene itself, it was about possibility. Can these bones live? A question that doesn't demand logic, but calls for faith. And here's the point many miss. God asks, not because he doesn't know the answer, but because he wants to provoke a decision within us. Faith isn't about feeling, it's about choosing to trust the impossible. He doesn't ask Ezekiel to build, to bury, or even to cry, just to speak. Sometimes God will call you to declare life in the very place you feel most powerless. And the truth is, Ezekiel didn't understand everything. He didn't see how it would work, but he obeyed. That's the kind of faith God honors. Not the one that sees, but the one that still speaks. The invitation is to look at the impossible and yet not back down. Because while everyone else sees a graveyard, God sees fertile ground. But the valley is just the beginning. Because something starts to move when a voice raises, even without having all the answers. Ezekiel stands in a valley of lifeless bones, and God gives him an assignment that seems absurd. Prophesy to these bones. It's like when you pray for a marriage that seems over, or declare healing when the diagnosis screams the opposite. Have you ever felt like God wanted to use your voice, your prayer, your song, your words, even when you saw no sign of change? That's the valley test. As Ezekiel speaks, something starts to shift. A noise, a rattling, bones coming together. Movement begins. Structure returns. But don't miss this. It looked like progress, but it was still dead. This moment exposes a painful truth. We can have form without life. Churches with music, programs, and lights, but no spirit. Relationships where routines remain, but love is gone. It's the skeleton of faith, structured but breathless. God was showing Ezekiel and us that it's possible to obey, to see progress, and still miss the essence. Because without the spirit's structure is just silence dressed in motion. But the story doesn't end there. Something even deeper is about to enter the scene. The bones were aligned, the tendons were there, the flesh had formed, but still, no life. That's when God gives Ezekiel a second instruction. Call the breath. The Hebrew word used here is ruach. It means breath, wind, spirit. It's not just air, it's divine energy. God was showing a pattern. Structure may come first, but only His Spirit can bring resurrection. The same is true for us. You can fix routines, clean your behavior, and still be lifeless inside, until the Ruach arrives. This moment in Ezekiel 37 is a prophetic echo of Acts 2, the day of Pentecost. Just like in the valley, the disciples were gathered, lifeless in courage, waiting for a promise they didn't fully understand. And suddenly, a sound like a rushing wind. The Ruach entered that room. It's the same Spirit, the same breath, the same God, bringing life to what seemed too afraid, too broken, too ashamed to rise. The valley wasn't just about Israel. It was a shadow of what was coming for the whole world. Let this sink in. Without the Spirit, we're just dressed up bones. We can speak well, sing well, organize well, but it's all cosmetics on a corpse. That's why revival doesn't begin with strategy, but with breath. You don't need a new routine, you need Ruach. Because when the Spirit enters, everything changes. Not just the noise, not just the form, but life. Real, undeniable, supernatural life. And with that breath comes the beginning of restoration. What looks like death to man often looks like potential to God. In Ezekiel's eyes, the valley was full of dry, scattered bones, the remains of what once was. But in God's eyes, those bones were not trash. They were not beyond repair. They were seeds, and seeds only look dead before they rise. God never calls something hopeless just because it's broken. In fact, He often begins His greatest works in the places we've given up on. Restoration doesn't start when everything is clean, it begins in the dust. The process is slow and intentional. First, bones come together, then tendons, then flesh. Then breath. God restores in stages, not in snapshots. And sometimes we get frustrated because we want full healing without walking through the process. But if God gave you the final product without rebuilding the structure underneath, it would collapse again. He's not a magician, He's a builder. He doesn't patch pain, He reconstructs purpose. And each layer matters. From invisible connections to visible strength, from internal wiring to external beauty. Imagine someone restoring a war-torn city. Brick by brick, sewer by sewer, one foundation at a time. That's how God works in lives, marriages, ministries. He's not just putting flesh on bones, He's rebuilding dignity, courage, trust, and calling. You might still feel like a pile of bones, but if He's working, you're not dead. You're in progress. That addiction might still rattle. That depression might still whisper. But underneath, restoration has already begun. You are not a graveyard. You are a battlefield turning into a garden. And here's the truth. God doesn't just restore what was. He creates what never was before. These bones didn't return to their old lives. They rose as a mighty army. That's the power of divine restoration. God tells Ezekiel that these bones represent the whole house of Israel. This was not just a metaphor, it was a map. It doesn't just fix the past. It prepares you for a future greater than anything you lost. So don't despise the valley. Don't rush the process. Because what God sees in your brokenness is not your ending. It's the beginning of something strong, something sacred, something eternal. The vision of dry bones wasn't just about personal revival. It was about a nation, a people, a prophetic future. God tells Ezekiel that these bones represent the whole house of Israel. This was not just a metaphor, it was a map that pointed toward a scattered people, long divided, soon to be united. Later in the same chapter, God tells the prophet to take 2 sticks, one for Judah and one for Israel, and join them into one. This act wasn't symbolic theater. It was a divine promise. Unity after exile, healing after division. For centuries, Israel had been fractured. Politically, geographically, spiritually, the northern and southern kingdoms were estranged. But God was prophesying a time when what was broken would be won again. And this wasn't only for ancient Israel. Through Christ, this prophecy opens up to the entire world. Jesus, the descendant of David, comes not just as a king, but as a shepherd to unite the flock. Ephesians calls it one new man, Jew and Gentile, brought together under the same covenant. 2 sticks, one king. And the language here is deeply messianic. God promises that David, my servant, will be their king forever, a clear pointer to the reign of Christ, the eternal Son of David. He speaks of a sanctuary, of His dwelling among them, of a restored land and an everlasting covenant. This is echoed in Revelation 21, when John hears the voice declare, "Behold, the dwelling place of God is with men." The vision that began in a valley of bones ends in a city of gold. From death to eternal communion. It is easy to miss how connected it all is. Ezekiel's vision is not isolated. It's a prophetic bridge. It links Israel's national hope with the church's spiritual future. It connects the restoration of a people to the resurrection of all things. And it reminds us, God doesn't just revive bodies. He restores nations, rebuilds identities, and redeems generations. The same God who saw an army in a valley of bones sees a bride in a broken world. And the final act of this prophecy is not simply life. its eternal presence. Let's pause and ask the question Ezekiel heard. Can these bones live? Maybe your bones are your marriage. Maybe it's your faith. Maybe it's your calling that feels buried under years of silence. Maybe it's your church. Polished on the outside but empty inside. We often walk through life like those bones, dry, disconnected, dismissed. And yet, God still asks a question. Not because he needs your answer, but because he wants your heart to awaken. It's an invitation to hope where hope seems foolish. Many of us live like decorated skeletons, structured, scheduled, and spiritual on the surface, but lifeless underneath. We attend, we perform, we smile, but without the ruach, it's all bones in motion. The tragedy of the church today is not the lack of people. It is the lack of breath. It's when services grow louder, but the spirit is silent. When programs replace presence, when emotion replaces encounter. God is not looking for museums of religion. He wants altars of fire. He's calling his people to stop playing dead. And here's a call. Prophesy over your own life. Speak what God says, even if your eyes see bones. Prophesy healing, prophesy restoration, prophesy unity. Because today, God is not just showing you a vision. He's inviting you into it. Don't walk away from the valley. Step into it. Speak into it. Wait for the wind. Because what was once lifeless can rise again. Not by might, not by power, but by his spirit. You don't need to feel qualified. Ezekiel didn't fully understand either. But faith doesn't require a full understanding. What looks like death, ruin, and despair is actually the fertile ground where God raises his armies. From dry bones to a living mission, this is a story of transformation. Remember, each bone in that valley had a name, a history, a purpose. And God has not forgotten a single one. It requires obedience. When you declare God's word over what looks dead, something starts to rattle. And as you keep speaking, the same spirit that raised Christ from the dead begins to breathe into your valley. So I ask you now, where are your bones? What part of you gave up breathing? The valley isn't the end, it's just the beginning. This ancient vision points us toward the ultimate hope. The new heaven and new earth described in Revelation 21, where God will wipe away every tear and death will be no more. It's a promise that no matter how dry or broken you feel, restoration is on the horizon. Your story isn't finished yet. God's breath still moves in the valley. So when you feel lost, abandoned, or forgotten, remember, you are not just a pile of bones. You are part of a divine masterpiece being carefully restored. The spirit who breathed life into Ezekiel's vision still breathes today, inviting you into new life, new purpose, and new hope. Now, I want you to take a moment and write in the comments. Breathe on me, Spirit of God. Let this be more than words. Let it be a prayer, a cry for new life, fresh hope, and unstoppable restoration. If this message touched your heart, share it with someone who's stuck in their own valley. Sometimes, one voice can spark a movement of life where death seemed to rule. And before you go, check out the next video. The only name erased from the book of life, the untold story. Because if the valley speaks about hope restored, this next story challenges us with the power of choice. What will you do with this second chance?